Welcome back to Road to Recovery podcast. Unfortunately, my partner, Tommy, cannot be here today. He is suffering from some injury, so we're wishing him the best. But that doesn't mean the show must go on, as they say. And we are joined here today with somebody whose name I am sure to mess up. It's Talia. Is that at least partially right? Talia,
yeah.
Talia. Not even going to pronounce the last name. It's right there.
It's right people. There, yeah. So Talia Cecchele.
Cecchele, but she's
nutrition.
Yeah, she's a registered dietitian who specializes in eating disorders, and she is a myth-busting son of a gun. I'm telling you, I love it. I was looking at your Instagram. I love anybody that is in the field professionally and has all that myth-busting stuff, because there's so much stigma around any of these types of things, or just health in general, that they're just insane. So I wanted to get this going and firstly ask you about, what was your inspiration to getting into nutrition and becoming a dietitian specializing specifically in eating disorders? Because that's kind of a more rare side of things.
Yeah, it's very niche for a dietitian. So if we just start sort of first with becoming a dietitian, I was very interested in food and cooking and sports when I was younger, and I played representative netball, and we actually had a dietitian come and speak to us when I was about 15, and I just, from that moment on, I knew that's what I wanted to do. So it's a bit lucky, I guess, that I knew from such a young age. And then I went to university and studied dietetics, and it was about 3 years out when I got a new position at a pediatric hospital. And on the very first day, my manager was allocating my wards to me, and she said that you're covering the eating disorders unit. And I was a bit scared at first, because as a dietitian, it's an area that is quite niche and specialized. I just sort of fell into it. And from that day on, so that's over 5 years now, I've been working in eating disorders and loving it.
That's really admirable, because I don't meet a lot of people, and a lot of people just in general, like people that have eating disorders, especially male people with eating disorders, don't want to talk about it at all. It's a very kind of hush thing. It's being more and more put out into the mainstream, which is awesome. People talk about it much more openly than they would have even 10 years ago, which is really great. And I'm thankful to have people like you that are interested in getting into this type of stuff and kind of delving into that layer of muck that is the eating disorder world.
Yeah.
But I am curious.
You're so right about the male percentage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's actually pretty startling, the amount of males that suffer from it. And I go to the gym and I see people that I know have some sort of body dysmorphia going on with them, whether that is manifesting an eating disorder or not, I don't know. But body dysmorphia within of itself is much more prevalent than I think people think.
Definitely.
So,
yeah.
But I'm curious, what has been kind of some of your biggest hurdles in your advocacy for eating disorder recovery? And is there anything you'd restructure in the care setting of those receiving inpatient or outpatient care? That's kind of a heated question. Yeah.
This is
loaded.
So much bigger than what I am able to control. But there's obviously not enough funding in eating disorders and mental health in general. And where I see a really big gap is, or not only being able to access treatment due to whether that be funding or stigma. So I've worked with a lot of people that have, years before coming to see me, have gone to a GP and either been told to lose weight because they've been in a larger body, and the GP has not known that they've had an eating disorder, which has been very triggering, or people that have been of a normal weight or even underweight, but have just not been sick enough to actually get help. So definitely, advocating for education for doctors, so they can actually diagnose this early on rather than waiting till it's, much more complex and people are much more unwell than they could be. So I think that's definitely one gap. And then the next is, so we know we have inpatient treatment and outpatient treatment, but there's not much in the middle for people. I don't know what it's like in the States, but definitely in Australia, where I'm originally from, and now I'm working in the UK in London, there's not as many sort of daycare centres or day treatment centres. And I think having that gap between inpatient, where it's so intensive, 24-hour support, to then drop into an outpatient setting where you might have, a dietitian session and a psychology session once a week each. It's just, sort of setting you up for failure. But unfortunately, there's not much at the moment that we can really do. So it's just, advocating and getting the funding for that sort of treatment.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good point that you bring up about that in-between time between being inpatient and outpatient. I was never an inpatient. I did all of my stuff outpatient. Sometimes in retrospect, I kind of wonder if at my 88-pound low point with having exercise addiction and OCD and all these different things playing into a manifestation of my eating disorder, anorexia, should I have been, quote, institutionalized or inpatient somewhere? At the same time, what I've seen with a lot of people that do go into inpatient, and this is just my experience and observation because I'm not an expert.
Yeah.
What I've seen is people go into these situations and they get refed, they get into a state where they're in a no longer physically harming state, like they're not in death's door. And then they get out and then they end up in this relapse state because they think it's gone. And I see this with other YouTubers who have dealt with eating disorders and just get back into this YouTube game and having to look a certain way and all these things. And then just in general, they get back into old patterns. And I even find myself, even now, I am still in recovery after. I call myself pseudo recovered because a lot of the mental work still needs to be done for myself. But what I see is that there needs to be some sort of, like you said, ongoing therapy even afterwards, after the main medical condition is taken over. I think that's where a lot of the stigma with some of the medical community, at least what I've seen in here in the US, is that a lot of doctors, at least general practitioners, look at it strictly from a physical standpoint.
Yes.
And so they assume that, like, I'll go in and be like, oh, your weight's good. But my mindset is like totally not. It's totally off kilter still.
Yeah.
No, continue.
No, I was just going to say, so even, when we look at discharging someone from an inpatient setting, we usually aim for discharge at least a BMI of 15 or 16, because the evidence supports that you're not, psychologically at the stage of being able to commit or engage to psychological therapy until you're at a higher weight. So then you get discharged from this really supportive environment at a bit of a higher BMI, but then you're deemed too well to be able to access a more supportive treatment. So it's exactly what you were saying. It's very much weight and physical health focused, and we're just missing that link.
Yeah, and I think this goes even beyond just the eating disorder kind of community part. I think it goes into other types of things, like I've mentioned on my channel and here a few times, that I deal with other chronic illness complications associated with it, and people with those things often find themselves in the same situation where, like, well, nothing shows up, so it's like there's no care for that, and then mental care is not there. So it's just advocacy, like you said, is the number one thing we can do, which can help in turn hopefully raise funding to get what needs to be done. So you as a registered dietitian, as a nutritionist, what is your, I suppose, structure for dietary intake regards to optimal diet for recovery? Like, as we see, there's like tons of different crazy stuff in the health community. I'm like a health nut, and this is something that I've been interested in since college, since before I developed extreme eating disorder tendencies. I was just always fascinated with physiology and how diet and stuff you manipulate. I just took it way too far. But there's so much crazy stuff. There's so much things that when put into the wrong mindset can be dangerous, like vegan, carnivore, vegetarian, there's keto. All these things are kind of thrown around and can be detrimental to people with this type of mindset. So what would your structure for dietary intake for optimal, like, diet recovery be when you're working with someone with an eating disorder or binge eating disorder or something like that?
So my approach is definitely not sexy. It does not sell, but it works. And it's really just, it's taking it back to the very basics of nutrition, and my saying is nourish with balance. So there's no restriction, there's no fad diets, there's no cutting out particular food groups. It is, 3 meals, 2 to 3 snacks a day. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner have a balance of your key macronutrients, so protein, carbohydrates, fats, with some added veggies or fruit. It's including all foods. So having, processed or high sugar, high energy foods, which I think is such a key part of recovery, not because, there's a component of challenging fears and rules about those sorts of foods, but also, normalizing them. We know, a big part of what I do is making food neutral. So there's no black and white, good and bad, healthy, clean. I do a lot of, work on food neutrality and challenging those food beliefs. When it comes to particular types or patterns of eating, so, thinking about intermittent fasting, veganism, vegetarianism, those sorts of things. I think nowadays it's a bit trickier than when I first started working in eating disorders, because veganism has exploded.
Yeah.
And even, as a dietitian, I'm very much aware of the environmental impact of the way that we eat. And I do know that we need to make choices for sustainability and for the environment. But for recovery from an eating disorder, I generally try not to have someone on a vegan diet, because it is more difficult just in terms of getting the right nutrients and enough calories from the food that you're eating, particularly if, vegetables are so fibrous and filling that if you have to eat 6 times a day, these huge portions of meals can cause quite a lot of discomfort.
Yeah. And
it really limits your ability to challenge a lot of those dietary rules or fear foods that you might have developed through having your eating disorder.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And something Tommy would point out if he was here is he himself was vegan for a very, very long time. I've known him for several years, and we actually both met because we were both doing YouTube. He was doing eating disorder space up. I was kind of working in more of a comedy space up, but we both had this eating disorder commonality. So that's how we got to know each other. And he's very passionate about a lot of the ethical aspects of veganism, which I completely respect, and they're totally valid things. But he mentions during his recovery, it was actually very detrimental to his health. He became he actually suffered from, I believe, a lot of like deficiency problems, specifically like in like iron, and I know you can have like B vitamin deficiencies sometimes, B12. And I think when you have the eating disorder mindset and the eating disorder voice type of the stuff, it's kind of a dangerous game to play, messing around with anything that is remotely in the name of restriction of something, because you have to question. And this is something that I've had to do, because I've had to make certain dietary changes just to manage my own neuropathic condition, because I noticed certain things flared up and certain things don't. But I have to ask myself always beforehand, before I make an action, is this from the guise of health, or is this my eating disorder voice telling me to restrict? And this is something that my recovery coach has had me basically write down and question. So I think if anyone's listening that's going through any type of stuff like that, is before you do anything, always ask yourself, where is this thought actually stemming from? I think that's a really important point.
Definitely. But no. Is it coming from a place of restriction? And I always try, if someone does, come and see me with some sort of dietary restriction, whether it be vegan or they've cut out a particular food group, or they're on like the low FODMAP diet because they have IBS symptoms, particularly for veganism, I say that you can be vegan later, but right now it's not the right thing for you. And you can do, lots of other things to still support a vegan way of living, whether that be clothing or makeup.
How do you approach clients who are struggling once you're working with them with sticking on a plan that you've set them with? Because this is something that I've personally had to deal with. And I say I dealt with, but really I was the problem. I've been put on plans, and then I've just like totally negated listening to that. So like, what are some strategies that you would use to kind of help that person get back on track with their recovery?
It's hard to stick to an eating plan. As we would know, eating disorder doesn't want to gain weight or to, challenge any behaviors. I always think there has to be, some sort of part of you that wants to make change. So if eating disorder is 100%, sometimes the best thing you can do is just maintain where you are. And it's, it's just feeding that healthy self week by week, day by day, to try and see the, purpose of recovery. So there's, different sort of motivational activities that I would do with my clients, whether that be, sort of projecting into the future and trying to think about what your life would be like in 5-10 years time with and without the eating disorder, doing a lot of pro and cons lists. So the pros of having the eating disorder, not having the eating disorder, and what life would be like and what it actually means for you. Thinking about everything that you value in your life and what makes your life meaningful, and how much of that is eating disorder. So often we do this in sort of like a pie chart. Some people do it as a flower with different petals representing what meaningful parts in their life, the percentage of their life that it represents, and just trying to build up those other aspects of your life so that the percentage of the eating disorder slowly reduces. I tend to make changes very slowly if someone's really struggling. So it's sort of like a micro change on their meal plan. It might be once a week to add, one extra glass of milk or something like that. Because every step, every extra mouthful really counts when you're recovering from an eating disorder. And definitely trying to, work with the person to see what's going to work with, for them, whether it be getting extra support at meal times, activities they can do after meal times, whatever's going to work, but it can be very individualized.
Yeah. And I think honestly, it has to be fairly individualized, because everybody's issue, no matter what it is, honestly, is always somewhat different, and they're always at a different pace. So I think this is something too that I think a lot of in the mainstream medical community, outside of the eating disorder and dietitians and stuff like that, is they kind of look at it as a one size fits all problem. And it's one of those things where medicine's moving that way, but you just can't treat a lot of these type of things as that. It just doesn't work, or it doesn't work very long.
Yes, definitely with diets.
Yeah, no joke. I actually was curious, for you, what has been personally one of your biggest hurdles working with clients that you've had, as a dietitian working with clients? What was one of your hurdles as you've kind of been working with people, trying to help them in their recovery and stuff like that? Yeah,
there's probably a few. I think one is that, as you would know yourself, it can be draining. As I'm sure your family, friends, because it is such a long road to recovery. And when you are pushing and pushing against the eating disorder, sometimes it can be, I've never lost hope for someone, but sometimes it can just be like, you just feel a bit low sometimes, especially when you know how much that person wants to change, but the eating disorder is just so strong. I think the other thing is, when I first started in eating disorders, I probably made quite a few mistakes in terms of the language that I was using with my clients. So that's something that I've overcome. And just just acknowledging the strength of someone's eating disorder, and particularly if they have other comorbidities such as, personality disorders, OCD. So it's just trying to work with that in order to help them move forward.
Yeah, no, so yeah, and kind of going along the lines of that, like as someone with OCD, it made me, a lot of my manifestation with eating disorders was with very number focused. So I was very focused on like the down to the T macronutrient gram number of like everything that was ever touching my plate ever. And so when you have something like that, I found what I did with my therapist was we did sort of challenges where we would have a weekly challenge of like, try not to do this or try to do this type of thing. Do you find that that type of stuff works really well as you kind of dribble it in there with your approach?
Yeah. So I normally have weekly homework. And often, I just say, we're going to, can you commit to this 1 week experiment where we change X, Y, and Z? What's your hypothesis? Usually the hypothesis will be something like, I'll gain 5 kilos. Okay, can we challenge that? How, as a percentage, how much do you believe that that's going to be true? And then we commit to that challenge, and at the end of the week, we reevaluate. And it's just building up that evidence that food is not the enemy.
Yeah, actually, that's the biggest thing. That's kind of one thing I wanted to talk about with you next is how do we stop viewing unhealthy food, the unhealthy food like cake or whatever. Anything could be unhealthy. Some people look at a potato and they say that's unhealthy.
Yeah.
So how do we stop looking at food and kind of categorizing it, and then also making it like a reward? Like, how do we stop viewing unhealthy food as a reward in a binge eating situation, or just in general, really?
Yeah. So in general, I think, particularly for binge eating, but in general, it is including these foods as just part of normal eating. So especially someone that has binge eating disorder or bulimia, that they're avoiding these foods and they're restricting particular foods or food groups. It's like Adam and Eve. Eve couldn't have the apple and she eventually gave in. You're going to eventually give in to these foods, and that's what triggers overeating and binge eating. So by including these foods as part of your normal diet and committing to that experiment of what happens if I have one biscuit once a week, does my weight change? No. So again, it's just building up that evidence and challenging that black and white thinking, because I think with eating disorders, they love everything to be black and white, and nutrition is so gray, many shades of gray, that you have to just keep challenging so that you get that flexibility back, because thinking's so rigid when it comes to these types of foods. So it's really just lots of experiments and just educating people about, the nutritional value of different foods. So all food provides us with energy, no matter what it is. I try to think of foods as being more nourishing and less nourishing options. So you want to have the more nourishing foods, which are those foods coming from the core food groups, your grains, fruit and veg, dairy, meat, etc., being on your plate most of the time, and then allowing yourself to have those more enjoyable foods as well. So that you're not restricting yourself of anything, because if you continually put cakes and biscuits and chocolate up on this pedestal, then you're never going to fully be able to recover.
Yeah, I was wondering if this is something that you do with any of your clients or not, because I've worked with a few dietitians, and one thing that I really liked with some of them was that they just changed one of the ways they did this and kind of uncategorized food was giving you a different way to look at it. So you look at food as like three different things, like, and I can't remember what they all are, but I like carbohydrates. Instead of saying carb, you say, this is my energy or something like that. So are those sort of acronym changes, have those things you've implemented in your own practice?
Yeah, so that's definitely one strategy. So, for example, if you had I keep using biscuit as an example, but for some people they'd be like, this is fat. So I'd be like, what else could it be? This is enjoyment. This is food. That. This is fuel. This is, so it's renaming that. The other thing I use quite often is like a fear food list. So pretending that you're going through the supermarket and you're, putting in your trolley any other, any food that your eating disorder hasn't allowed you to have, and then categorizing it from the one that's the most challenging to the least, and just working from the bottom up, week by week, picking something that you can challenge. And usually if you start from the bottom, by the time you're sort of halfway up, you tend to realize that nothing's really changed, and that all food is sort of, it lessens the value that those fear foods have.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, all of the stuff that you've shared with us so far is really important. And I think that if there's one thing we can really take away at the end of it is that I think it's important to find someone like yourself to work with when you're doing this, because for a long time, I, for one, thought that I could get on with most of it on my own. And I think there is this level of denial that all people with eating disorders share. There's like phases of eating disorders where you have like the denial phase. And in that phase, there's not too much you can do from an outside perspective, as far as like being a parent or somebody like that. But if you were to talk, let's say a parent is watching this and their kid is struggling, what would be something that you would mention to them as to kind of get the ball rolling for them without making it seem like they're trying to force them into some sort of like prison camp type situation, you know?
Yeah. So I would definitely recommend reading a book by Janet Treasure called How to Care for Your Loved One with an Eating Disorder. It gives you so many tips and strategies on how to actually support your loved one. But I think just being there for that person and letting them know that you understand that it's really difficult and you're there to support them and that it's okay and that you will get through it. Because we know that eating disorders like to isolate people, and often they will push your family members away. So just acknowledging that, you know, I think one thing, particularly with parents, is to let them know that it's not their fault, first of all, because often the parents carry a lot of guilt.
Yeah.
The way that they brought up their child has, you know, created this eating disorder. So letting them know it's not their fault. And just, I guess it's educating them about how eating disorders work, that they will, you know, the young person or just even an adult might display anger, frustration at that person, but just reinforcing that that's the eating disorder and it's not them. So it's not dividing that unit, that family unit apart.
Well, I really think you've shared a lot of really insightful stuff with us today. I really appreciate you taking the time to just sit down and talk to us. Even though Tommy's not here, you missed out on a good one, Tommy. But if you want to hear more from Talia here, you can find her on Instagram at TC Nutrition. She has a blog. She has all sorts of stuff. Is there any more you'd like to add where they can find you?
Just my website, so www.taliacecchele.com. I'm also on Facebook, Talia Cecchele Nutrition.
Awesome. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.